Takahashi, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're representing here Scrum Venture, and one of your specialty and what you've been doing all your career is bringing foreign startups and try to grow them and develop them here in Japan. You've been doing that with Uber. Yep. You were very involved in the launch of Uber Eats here in Japan.
That's right.
And then you went to WeWork. Originally, you're a marketer and you've been working at Sony. Mm-hmm. And now with Scrum Studio, you try to bring in new startups here and try to connect them with big Japanese industry, big Japanese player. How is it going? Because there's always this reluctance sometimes we hear of big industry player, and they are not used to work with foreign partners and smaller partners. How is it doing? How is it going?
Yeah, very good question. So I think at Scrum Ventures, what we do is we're venture capital. So we invest in startups, mostly U.S. startups, Japanese as well. So we've invested in about 120 startups so far. And our investors, our LPs, are mostly Japanese corporations. So they invest in our fund, and we use those funds to invest in startups is what we do. And on top of just simply investing in startups, we have our studio business, which encompasses bringing those startups into Japan. So our portfolio comes into Japan, also using our kind of startup network to source startups for these large corporations who are interested in working with cutting-edge startups, innovative startups, to build new businesses together. So that's what we do as a business. So we kind of go beyond simply investing to helping kind of build new businesses together. I think overall, if you look back at the last, we've been in business for 10 years. 10 years ago, the corporations in Japan were interested in global startups in Silicon Valley, for example. There weren't that many CVCs back then. And in the last 10 years, that's really changed. There's a lot of corporate venture capital money now, more presence in Silicon Valley by Japanese companies. So I think the level of understanding, of interest has definitely increased over the last 10 years. I would say that there have been successful cases and cases where it just took longer than expected. And I think in the cases where it has really worked, the commonality is that there's generally some kind of champion in the company, in the large Japanese company, who's willing to go to bat, who's willing to kind of say, this is the company we want to work with for these reasons, and really kind of see eye to eye with the founders themselves. So a lot of these champions, they are very interested in not just what the product or what the startup is about, but also in the founding story. So getting to really understand the founder and why the startup exists in the first place, and building a relationship with them so that they can kind of go to bat on the corporate side. But generally speaking, yes, I think there are many times where it just takes a long time, or it's just an idea. And it doesn't really go beyond the idea phase. Whereas on the startup side, what they want is they want to grow their business. They want to grow revenues, they want to grow user bases, and that's where sometimes it's the setting the expectation up front of what each side wants. I think is very important.
And those connections, those links that you are creating within Scrum Studio, do they have to happen here in Japan, or because I see in the automotive industry, Toyota is building a lot of research and development, but outside of Japan to reach new autonomous or AI or new green engine and stuff like that. So do they feel the need to incorporate or to work with those startups here in Japan, or they prefer to cooperate with them in the US or in Europe? What's the trend?
Yeah, I've seen both cases. So one of the characteristics of our open innovation programs that we run on various themes, such as smart city and well-being, climate tech, sports, is that oftentimes we have different Japanese municipalities involved in those programs as well. So when the municipalities are involved, like for example, Kashima Prefecture or Yokohama, or these large and small municipalities, they're able to really talk about the needs, the societal needs that they're facing in their cities and in their prefectures, and they're oftentimes very willing to accommodate a proof of concept or some kind of trial or pilot happening in their region. So that's often very helpful to really accelerate the go-to-market of different business ideas. But there have been cases where those different trials and things have happened outside of Japan. For example, there was a case when Japan Railway East, JR East, who is one of our partners in our Smart City program, they ran a pilot in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, near San Francisco. So I think there, both patterns are possible. But oftentimes I think the Japanese companies also feel a little bit kind of at ease when these things happen, they trial in Japan first, kind of near where they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are the fields where you see the most development in those partnerships you are creating? You're talking about mobility, but is it aging? Is it AI? Where are the fields that are really growing at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there are different fields. So the ones we are heavily involved in are smart city, well-being, and kind of as another kind of a theme around well-being. We recently launched a program around age tech. So age tech, with the senior aging population in Japan. Climate tech is obviously a very, very interesting field. I think that's one where I think more and more there's going to be demand to do things outside of Japan as well. And the last one is sports. We recently raised a new fund around sports and entertainment. So we're working with different sports teams, sports leagues, new stadiums, arenas, things like that, to bring in different innovation from overseas, to incorporate it into their new stadiums, for example, for better fan engagement and things like that. So yeah, it's really across the board. I wouldn't say there's one that's particularly strong, but I think there's a lot of interest now by these larger corporations in Japan now to accelerate building businesses with startups.
Okay. Where do we stand here in Japan? You, as a VC, you also invest directly in startups growing here in Japan with Japanese engineers or Japanese creator founders. Where do we stand now? We see more VC money coming, but it's still a small portion of what goes to China or Southeast Asia or India. So do you feel that the reluctance that we had, maybe young guys coming from KOO or Waseda, they were still preferring to go to Toyota or Toshiba than to risk everything to go for startups. Is it changing slowly? Are you optimistic? Have you nice stories? Are we going to see more unicorns coming out of Japan in the next years?
I think it's changing. Now, the speed at which it's changing is what we need to talk about. How much can we really accelerate it? For example, in the last 10 years, the investment into startups has tenfolded. So it's become 10 times as much as 10 years ago. And now the government is trying to, pump a lot of money in to 10x that in the next 5 years. So I think we're trying to accelerate that pace, and I think France has done a really good job in the last 10 years or so to really do that. I think there are more and more startups coming out of universities, but I think that also can be accelerated further. Especially kind of, I think Japan, because the market is big enough, let's say, for many of these companies, when they start, they kind of see the Japanese market as an addressable market. But I think with more kind of collaboration and more interactions with non-Japanese markets, whether it's the US or Europe or elsewhere, I think more and more companies are seeing that there's an opportunity, wider opportunity outside of Japan as well. So I think that's a big opportunity for Japan. Now, when it comes to younger people wanting to join the industry, I think that's also changing as well. Yeah. And that's also related to, I think the general pay grade or the salary ranges are going up on the startup side. I think there's a wider understanding of how stock options and things like that work. And I think the government is also trying to make more and more reforms to make the kind of the incentive for joining the startup. So to taking that risk, they need to make sure that there's an incentive aligned with that risk. And I think there's more push from the government to make that more accessible and flexible for employees. So it's changing. Now, we're hoping that that'll only accelerate in the coming years.
So you believe that the government or municipalities like Tokyo have a role to play in growing startups? Because there's this debate in the US, most of them do it without any help from the government. France and Japan think that public money or public help could help. Where do you stand?
I think in Japan, the boost is necessary. Because I think that the speed of kind of incremental change, which I think Japan has traditionally kind of gone through, is probably not going to keep up with the pace at which the country needs more innovation, more startups coming out of Japan. So I think it's a really strong initiative and leadership by the Japanese government and the Prime Minister to make these things an actual policy. And they just built a Silicon Valley kind of innovation hub as well, things like that. So it's definitely in the right direction. And I do hope that, I think France has done a really amazing job in the last 10 years to, build the Station F and things like that. And I hope that there is more and more coming, not just Japanese startups, but also attracting foreign talent to come to Japan and foreign companies to come to Japan to innovate here as well.
Last question, I don't know if it's sensitive. how do you look at what SoftBank and Sonsan is doing? He's been putting a lot of money with his vision funds. It's very difficult to evaluate where he stands because the valuation of most of the companies is done by himself as long as those companies are not on the market yet. So where do we stand? Was it positive or did he really help some companies or he threw too much money? You knew about the WeWork, what happened. WeWork Japan is a bit a different case from WeWork US. But how do you judge his action and his impact on both on VCs, your work, and both on startup development?
Yeah, I think only time will tell. I think there's, in the short term, when you make such big investments, there's going to be good years where the valuation goes up or the company does well. There are bad years when it really sinks, and so there's a lot of volatility. I think, at least my understanding of his thesis is that in the long term, when you look 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, that this general shift towards, artificial intelligence, towards technology, towards digitization, that'll just come into fruition. So I think he's betting more on the thesis than he is on the specific. Obviously, the specific individual companies, some had issues and blah blah blah. We've all kind of read about that. But that said, I know on the startup side and on the investment community, it's also had impact just because of how big his war chest was. Right, his funds were so big, and they were willing to put in so much money. So that did really affect the capital that was available to startups and founders. Maybe not so much now, but a couple of years ago, it really affected valuations, which is now starting to come down. So I think that the current correction is a natural cycle. But I think in the long term, the thesis towards artificial intelligence and technology playing a larger role in people's lives and the way we operate, I think is directionally the way society will go. So I'm excited about how some of these companies will turn out. But I think, generally speaking, investment into the future, I think, is required in Japan as well as other markets today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.